Seeing these big banks on Bay Street reminds me of the expression I've always heard that money makes the world go round. Professor Chomsky and Richard Sanders' revelation that Canada sold arms to the US in its war in Vietnam made me suspect that finance must play a role within Canadian foreign policy. But what role does it precisely play, and does this role conflict with Canada's image as a benevolent force in the international arena? I need to find out.
So Canadian foreign policy dresses itself up in human rights clothing and democracy clothing. But everybody knows that pays any attention to it. The Canadian foreign policy is a reflection of Canadian corporate economic interest. And these days, that means the financial sector.
The relationship between capital and the state in Canada is deeply interwoven. The individuals in government move back and forth between government and business. The government has always understood itself to be, to have at least one of its central roles was to support capital. This, by the way, is not a conspiracy. This is official policy. If you look at Canada's Global Markets Action Plan from 2013, they specifically say that the top priority for foreign policy will be to marshal those resources towards private capital, towards the needs of private Canadian capital. So this is not new. This is not a conspiracy. It is how the Canadian state understands its role in the world.
So the Canada Pension Plan Investment Board invests in just about every horrendous corporation that you can imagine. If you're involved in an organization that's promoting social justice, human rights, development, health, the environment, then all you have to do is go and look at the list of companies that the CPP is invested in, and you will find your worst enemy in there, or a bunch of them. Tobacco industries, oil companies, huge mining companies, and war industries are also in there.
What was the legislative change which allowed the Canadian Pension Plan Investment Board to start investing our pension monies in companies that indirectly and directly profit from war?
Well, in the late 90s, Prime Minister Chrétien was in power, and his finance minister was Paul Martin. And it was during that time that the whole Canada Pension Plan was restructured. Before that, they used to invest in major infrastructure projects in Canada, but then they changed it so that they would basically play the stock market. All the money, all the CPP money from that point on went into investing in huge corporations. And so they invest in thousands of huge companies. They figure that's the best way to make money. It's not the best way to promote so-called Canadian values. If you want to promote Canadian values, you don't invest in the world's biggest war industries, the biggest polluters.
From a more clear sort of political imperialist dimension, Canada's a major supporter of the International Monetary Fund and the World Bank pushing structural adjustment policies in Africa and elsewhere, beginning in the early 1980s and through the 1980s into the 90s and to varying degrees up until today. Canada spent hundreds and hundreds of millions of dollars via the IMF and the World Bank supporting structural adjustment policies. Canadian officials at the IMF were proponents of pushing structural adjustment. Basically what structural adjustment policies were about saying that countries had to follow a certain set of economic policies that were dictated by the IMF. It said if you want another loan, you have to privatize your state-owned companies, you have to cut social spending, you have to basically reorient your economy to serve foreign investors and multinational corporations. And Canada was a strong proponent of that. Canada not only put money into the IMF, World Bank structural adjustment policies directly through those institutions, but also directly through the Canadian International Development Agency. The Canadian International Development Agency spent in Africa hundreds of millions of dollars in the 1980s pushing structural adjustment policies, and that had devastating effects on generally on the poorest in different, in Ghana or Zambia, different countries in Africa. And some of the main beneficiaries of those policies were international mining companies, and more specifically Canadian mining companies, Canada being now the biggest mining country. A huge number of the world's mining companies are listed on Canadian stock exchanges or based at Toronto or Montreal or Vancouver.
Barrick Gold is the largest gold mining company in the world, with its headquarters in Toronto, Canada. Barrick Gold's mining operations in several developing nations, such as Tanzania, have devastated villages and killed countless civilians. Civilians who protest Barrick Gold's mining operations are labeled as intruders and are attacked by Barrick Gold-appointed security forces.
Kwa hiyo lile jina wanaloita wananchi kwamba intruder waliache wawaite wajasiriamali. Wawaite wajasiriamali sio intruder. Intruder haipendezi. Unaua jamii. Mpaka unaitukana hivi serikali umeifumbaje macho?
Some of the people, they are believing that the white man like you, the white man and woman are their enemies. Their enemy is the government and the Canadians, all Canadians.
I'd say with the Liberals, there's quite a few things that the Liberals say, with which I would agree, and I think NDPers generally would agree. The problem with the Liberals is they say one thing and they do another thing. So the Liberals had promised, for example, that they would monitor, that they would create some sort of office that could investigate allegation of human rights abuses in developing by the extractive sector in developing countries. Well, they here again in French we say la montagne a accouché d'une souris. The mountain gave birth to a mouse, because what they've set up has no teeth. Is just basically the status quo under a new name, and even the members, the civil society people who were on the committee just resigned because they could see that it was going nowhere.
The Canadian state will pursue the I would call the agenda of global capital, even in some cases where it may not directly benefit a specific Canadian company. But it will do so because it understands that long-term, big picture, being seen as a partner in the projects of imperialism will have benefits for capital down the line. Canadian companies got massive contracts for the so-called reconstruction of Afghanistan. And they got those contracts because Canada played its part in the occupation of that country. Canada played along with the war on terror in Afghanistan. Actually played along with the war on terror in Iraq too, and in several other places, the bombing of Libya, of Mali, intervention in Syria, several cases in the war on terror where Canada played its part. And the reward that it got was contracts. SNC-Lavalin got contracts. SRK Consulting got contracts. Bombardier got contracts. These companies were given the rewards of empire. And the Canadian state always understands that that's what's at stake in these kinds of conflicts. That's part of what motivates it to participate.
It's not that the political stratum that is in charge, whether be it liberal or conservative, it's not that they're simply puppets of these corporations. They have their own interests, especially parties like the Liberal and Conservative Party that have been running the state for many years. But the fundamental duty of a party in power is to get reelected. And the fundamental duty of a party out of power is to get elected. And to do that, you have to make sure of two things. One, you're going to get financed by corporate Canada. And two, people's well-being, economic well-being, is at least good enough or enough people is at least good enough that they're going to vote for you.
Having listened to people like Paul Jay, Eve Engler, and Tyler Shipley, it was clear to me that financial interests have a strong influence on how Canadian foreign policy is shaped. However, as it pertains to how Canada's foreign policy is understood by Canadians, I knew it was the media that was responsible for this. I decided to go out and ask Canadians whether they believed the Canadian media was doing a good job in informing the public about Canada's foreign policy.
Do you believe that what the Canadian media tells you about Canada and what Canada is doing around the world, do you find that information to be truthful, reliable?
I do.
I would say that there are a lot of different facets of Canadian media. So I think some are probably doing a better job than others. I tend to trust publicly funded outlets like CBC more than others.
Do you believe that what the Canadian media, the news media, what they report, what they say about what Canada is doing around the world, do you find that information to be truthful or reliable?
Not particularly. I think it's following its own interests.
What do you think those interests are?
Profit. Profit.
Who owns the Canadian media? Well, first of all, CBC. So CBC is publicly owned, but who nominates the president of the CBC, the Prime Minister? And the board of CBC is nominated by the Prime Minister. So the politics, the mission, the interests that the Canadian government represents, meaning corporate Canada and specifically finance, that's the lens through which they appoint the president of the CBC, and it trickles all the way down. I know when I used to executive produce a daily debate show on CBC called Counterspin for 10 years. And we were on the cable news channel, at that time it was called CBC News World. And they left us kind of alone because it was a debate. So we would always have a spectrum of what I would call the real left of Canada. But the right and the Conservatives always got on. So because it was a debate, and because our ratings were good, they kind of left us alone. But we would do stories. For example, when the weapons inspectors were finding no weapons of mass destruction in Iraq, we would have debates with people who really knew what the weapons inspectors were doing. And the next day, no reflection of that on the nightly news. The nightly news would be covering stories like, should there be more heavier armor on Canadian tanks in Afghanistan? And we would be doing a debate about, can you ally with warlords and still expect to have democracy in Afghanistan? Well, we would do these stories, and they would never show up in any form on the nightly news, because the nightly news was very controlled. Peter Mansbridge was connected, as far as I understand it, to the Conservative Party, but very close to the Liberal Party leadership. Prime ministers could get Mansbridge on the phone, and this kind of self-righteous, supposedly liberal view of the world that CBC frames was very connected with the power and the foreign policy thinking of Ottawa.
We have the luxury of being where we are geostrategically, protected by the oceans that surround us, and we have one neighbor, the biggest military power in the world. So there's not much question about which side we're on, but we still are independent, and our independent media should be challenging always what it is and where it is they're sending our soldiers.
So how does Canadian media cover foreign policy? Well, it covers it as a reflection of the interests that drive the foreign policy, because it's the same financial institutions that own all the private media. So CBC is a reflection of the government thinking. Not to say that individual journalists don't do good jobs, and not to say there isn't often real criticism of certain things of the Canadian government or foreign policy. But the underpinnings and the basic worldview is consistent with how the Canadian professional state looks at foreign policy. And look at CBC's coverage of Venezuela on the whole. Maybe there's some exceptions, or Iran. Canadian government echoes all the rhetoric against Iran that the United States has. But the Canadian media a little bit goes after Saudi Arabia, but they don't make the point that how can Canada be so self-righteous about Iran and have little spiffs with Saudi Arabia, but are happy to sell them arms, and they have no diplomatic relations with Iran, but you can have them with Saudi Arabia.
We are selling $15 billion of deadly weapons to this government. Anybody with an ounce of journalistic integrity would ask this question every time Justin Trudeau says that he's committed to human rights and the rules-based international order. How do you reconcile that supposed commitment with the sale of weapons to Saudi Arabia? Very simple question to ask. It is almost never asked. What the media does is it uncritically repeats the claims that the government is committed to human rights, and you hear it often enough as an uninformed citizen. Few citizens have the time to go out and investigate how horrific the Saudi autocracy really is. And you hear that uncritically repeated over and over again, you begin to believe it. That's the function of the media in terms of perpetuating this mythology about Canada.
Interviewing Paul Jay and Dimitri Lascaris has helped me to understand how finance plays a role in determining Canada's foreign policy, especially in the case of Canada's relationship with Saudi Arabia. However, I feel I need to better understand how can Canada and Justin Trudeau justify selling arms to Saudi Arabia for the sake of profit, while Saudi Arabia massacres innocent men, women, and children in Yemen, a nation on the brink of famine. Furthermore, how can Justin Trudeau call himself a feminist on the one hand and approve of selling weapons to Saudi Arabia on the other? To get answers, I decided to interview Dennis Horak, Canada's former ambassador to Saudi Arabia.
It's very difficult. We've been selling, and it principally involves the light armored vehicles from London, Ontario. But these are vehicles that we've been selling to Saudi since the early 90s. I do understand that there are people who have concerns about selling arms to a country like Saudi Arabia. The question is really a much more fundamental one, is do we want to have an arms industry or not? And if the answer to that is yes, and it does provide tens of thousands of jobs in Canada, very, very well-paying, high-tech jobs, as well as some of the R&D that goes along with it, it's a valuable component of our economy. So, but if we want to be in that business, we have to understand that when we sell arms to countries, they're going to be used, or there's a potential that they can be used. I think for some Canadians who think, okay, let's have an arms industry, but whenever they get used, people get concerned. That comes with the territory.
The government will make investments of hundreds of millions of dollars supposedly to help military industries produce jobs. So that's how it's sold. That's how they justify it. That's how they explain themselves and what they're doing. But military industries are the least efficient way, one of the least efficient ways ever imagined in the history of the world to help to create jobs. If you want to create jobs, it's far more efficient. You can create many times more jobs through donations or investments in healthcare, in public transit, mass transit, or schools, or those sort of donations, those sort of investments.
Now, there is the risk always about, are these arms or various, whether it's light armored vehicles or others that we sell, are they going to be used to violate human rights? And we have an export control system that is very clear on that. And the embassy, certainly we did, and I know when I was director for the Gulf before at headquarters, this was a constant issue, looking to see whether arms that we have supplied have been used for human rights abuses, and what the potential, even in advance of the sale, the potential that they would be used for human rights abuses in the country. And we've consistently, we have had no evidence that, for example, the light armored vehicles that we sold to Saudi Arabia have ever been used to violate human rights in Saudi Arabia. Now there's the war in Yemen, and people are saying, well, okay, it's being used in the war in Yemen. But the kind of vehicles that were used, that we've sold them, are have been used, to my knowledge in any case, have been used largely along the border to safeguard the border, because there have been lots of skirmishes along the border with Yemen. There's been a lot of projectiles fired into Saudi Arabia from Yemen as well.
These so-called controls are actually guidelines, and they're filled with weasel words. So that the guidelines say that Canada shouldn't export any military goods to countries that are at war or under imminent threat of war, or that may likely use those weapon systems to against their own civilians. But it's just a guideline, so you can ignore the guideline.
My problem is we're supposed to have, minister and the prime minister always say, oh, we have such a strong system. Our system says now, even before accession or a year ago, already said that, you shouldn't sell arms to countries where there's human rights abuses, unless there's no reasonable risk that the arms will be used to commit human rights abuses. Well, I think in the case of Saudi Arabia, it's quite obvious that not only the risk is enormous, the Saudis themselves have acknowledged that they're using them against civilians for the repression in the eastern part of the country.
It is now abundantly clear, based on the things activists and academics have been telling me, that Canada's real foreign policy is a far cry from this rosy picture I had been taught in school. So, I started visiting Robarts Library and began looking into critical literature on Canada's foreign policy, and that is when I saw David Webster's book on Canada's involvement in Indonesia's occupation of East Timor. I picked up the book and began reading it. It was a revelation. One of the things I found out was that, similar to Canada's relationship with Saudi Arabia, Canada's decision to remain allies with Indonesia, while Indonesia invaded and occupied East Timor, was also due to the fact that Canada felt it was in its financial interests to stay silent in the midst of massacre and bloodshed.
400 miles northwest of Darwin, at the eastern end of the Indonesian archipelago, lies East Timor. For 300 years, it was a Portuguese colony. Then in 1974, the Portuguese colonial empire began to break up. In early 1975, preliminary elections were contested by the rival independence movements. And in November 1975, Fretilin declared an independent East Timor. But that wasn't before a bitter civil war, with Indonesia supporting Fretilin's opponents. Then in December 1975, with the knowledge of the United States, Indonesia invaded East Timor.
Indonesia invaded East Timor in December 1975, had a green light from Washington. The U.S. UN ambassador, Daniel Moynihan, who's lauded for his dedication to human rights and international law, just take a look at his memoirs. He said, I was able to render the United Nations utterly ineffective in responding to the Indonesian invasion. And then he mentions This was a couple of months after the invasion. He said, well, 60,000 people have been killed, but, who cares? It's going to go on. It did go on to be the worst genocide relative to population in the post-war period. Canada had a major role in supporting the invasion. It had interests in Indonesia, resources, mining, supporting the United States. Never lifted a finger to try to do anything to stop it.
There was an assertion made that the Canadian government was aware of the invasion of East Timor, and this was an assertion made and consistently denied by Canadian diplomats all through the Indonesian occupation period. But if you look at the documentary record, which is now declassified, the documents do show that the Canadian government was in fact aware of the Indonesian army's plans to intervene in East Timor several months before it happened, and that was repeated 3 days before the invasion happened, and that Canada never did anything to try to prevent that invasion from happening. So I'll give you an example. So Derek Burney was the head of the Asia Pacific, the responsible division in the Department of Foreign Affairs that was dealing with the Asia Pacific region, and particularly with Indonesia. Derek Burney would go on to become clerk of the Privy Council under Brian Mulroney, so he was in effect the chief civil servant of Canada. So he's a distinguished diplomat, a distinguished civil servant. His memoir says that the invasion of East Timor came as a surprise to Canadian officials. But if you look at the documents in the files in the National Archives in Ottawa, these are Department of Foreign Affairs files that have been declassified in recent years, the record shows that there were several messages given to the Canadian government that Indonesia was considering intervention into East Timor, that President Suharto raised that personally with Prime Minister Pierre Trudeau on a visit to Ottawa earlier in 1975, that the Indonesian Foreign Minister Adam Malik raised it with the Canadian Foreign Minister Alan McEachen, and that there were other indications given on multiple occasions. You see the same thing in American records, for instance, CIA daily briefings to President Ford. And this even appears as Indonesia may well invade East Timor in memoranda signed by Derek Burney.
I was 12 years old when Indonesia invaded the country. I joined my parents and we lived for 3 years in the jungle. In the jungle, we're suffering so many suffering, all kind of suffering. Dying of starvation, dying of disease, and killing by Indonesian military. 1978 to 1979, it was a dramatic year for us. I saw with my eyes those who were killed in front of in front of me. Those husband and wife embrace each other and die. Every inches of places that we were hiding bombed. I would like to say that in one place called Matibian Mountain, they drop 40 bombs a day. They also use napalm bomb, where the United States used in Vietnam War.
Canada at the time is trying to build a strategic partnership with Indonesia. Pierre Trudeau's government is trying to diversify its trade away from dependence on the United States, trying to cultivate new allies in the global south and the so-called third world. Indonesia loomed as a promising partner for Canada. So in 1968, when the Canadian International Development Agency was formed, Pierre Trudeau's new major aid organization for sending out overseas development assistance, it identified Indonesia as the first country of concentration for Canadian aid outside the Commonwealth and the former French Empire. So the first non-British, non-French colony would be Indonesia. It's a country of concentration for Canadian aid. By the end of the Trudeau years, the end of the Mulroney years, certainly Indonesia is among Canada's top overseas development assistance recipients. So Canada is trying to create a partnership with Indonesia. it did not serve that interest for Canada to raise complaints on human rights grounds or to stand up for East Timor because they saw it as a small country. So when Trudeau visited Indonesia in the early 80s, he said that issues of self-determination and human rights for the Timorese people have been raised, but on balance, we decided that we would support Indonesia. And that was the policy of the Canadian government, in effect. On balance, we support Indonesia. We will not make waves over this. So could Canada have stopped the invasion of East Timor? We'll never know because there was no effort made.
Blaine Briere of the East Timor Alert Network says the media, including As It Happens, are ignoring the Canadian angle in this story, the fact that Canada supports Indonesia despite Indonesia's aggression in East Timor. Wouldn't your audience be interested in hearing Canada's human rights policy in this matter debated?
I'm not sure. We've tried to get an assessment of how interested or how connected. Interested is not the right word, but that connection and that relation.
Presence in the gallery today of His Excellency Dr. Mokhtar Kussumadamaja, Minister of Foreign Affairs of Indonesia.
Mr. Speaker, Canada has allotted $300 million in aid through CETA to Indonesia over a 5-year period. How can this government continue to ignore the fact that Indonesia has invaded East Timor with 40,000 troops and is conducting Operation Extinction, which is tantamount to genocide?
At our suggestion, the Canadian ambassador in Indonesia was invited to visit East Timor to see conditions for himself. He believes that the arguments that have been made by various groups are exaggerated. I'm sure that I speak for the government of Indonesia in indicating that they would be prepared to welcome the honourable member to come and see for himself.
Is the minister saying, Mr. Speaker, that he has received from the Foreign Minister of Indonesia and from our ambassador in Indonesia and other sources sufficient evidence that the military occupation of East Timor has come to an end?
In a word, Mr. Speaker, yes.
Foreign powers, which have important economic relations with Indonesia, really don't care about what's happening in East Timor, and it reinforces Indonesia's determination just to continue its occupation of East Timor, because they know very well that countries like Canada will not rebuke Indonesia and will not punish Indonesia for its activities in East Timor. So it is an encouragement to the Indonesians in carrying on in East Timor just the same as ever.
Canadian economic interests in Indonesia are a major determining factor for Canadian government policy. The biggest investor is Inco. So, nickel mining in Northern Ontario and Manitoba is Inco's origin, right? So there's a Canadian nickel mining company that becomes a global nickel mining company. The second mining contract signed by General Suharto after he came to power in the 1960s, the second mining contract signed by his government was with Inco to develop a large nickel mining complex on the island of Sulawesi. And on the strength of this one major mining investment alone, Canada becomes one of the top foreign investors in Indonesia. And then after Inco, a number of other Canadian companies follow them into the Indonesian market.
Over 50% of all the new applications for contracts of work in mining are Canadian. Not Australian, not Japanese, not American, not European. They are Canadian. It's not just Bre-X. It's a multitude of Canadian companies that are looking at how to find their niche in the very rich mineral deposits of that country.
So Canada's been selling military goods to Indonesia off and on since 1975. The Timorese diplomatic resistance leader, José Ramos Horta, says Canadian bullets were used in the invasion, bullets made at Valcartier Industries in Quebec. But it's on a low scale. Barbara McDougall froze arms export permits so that no military goods could be exported from Canada to Indonesia. The Chrétien government, with André Ouellet being the key figure as foreign minister, decided to restore new economic development assistance, but more importantly, to restore issuing arms export permits to Indonesia. And part of the push that the Chrétien government is making for more and more exports is a push to sell more military exports around the world. And we know about that from countries like Saudi Arabia becoming major Canadian markets for military goods. But there are many countries, Indonesia among them. So military export permits authorized move from the thousands of dollars to the tens of millions of dollars under the Chrétien government. So Canada is willing and in fact eager to sell military products to Indonesia. And this continues right up until 1998, when Canadian policy finally shifts in the last year of the Indonesian occupation of East Timor, and a change finally takes place. But that change needs to be seen in the context of 23 years of consistent Canadian economic, diplomatic, and even military support for Indonesian rule in East Timor, and the deaths and human rights violations that went with it.
One of the most pressing issues in the world today is climate change. Climate change is a global issue, and therefore, Canada's handling of the issue plays an important part of our foreign policy. Without question, in Canada, there's a tension among politicians between fulfilling the interests of big oil corporations and protecting our environment. Interestingly enough, Canadians I spoke to all felt that climate change was an important issue and that the government wasn't doing enough on it.
Do you think Canada's doing enough on climate change, or is it an important issue?
Yes, it is an important issue. They should do a lot for it, because look at today, like it's in the middle of August, and this is it's July weather, like something's happening, so they should do something with the environment and climate.
Do you think climate change is a big issue in Canada?
Yes.
Do you think our government's doing enough on climate change?
No.
It's definitely an issue. I mean, look what's happening. We're losing all of our ice caps. They're deteriorating at a rapid rate, right? So, I mean, and they've been warning everybody about this for years and years and years. But you know what? Who does the government cater to? The small little person like you or me, or the big companies, the big corporations, the ones that are causing all of this, right? Our government was supposed to be for the people, but it's all about the dollar, right? It's the mighty dollar dictates, right? So what are we supposed to do about it?
As I said on the very first trip to the oil patch back in 2012, no country would find 173 billion barrels of oil in the ground and just leave them there. The resource will be developed. Our job is to ensure that this is done responsibly, safely, and sustainably.
The second half of the sentence is no country would find all this oil and just leave it there, even if it means the species may not survive. Because that's what he's really saying. And I wonder if he would be willing to say that. I mean, obviously he wouldn't, because that's not something that you say. But that is what, if that is what is at stake, and we all know that that is what is at stake, then that's what he's really saying.
The objective of transforming the economy away from fossil fuel is a big deal in Canada. It may be a bigger deal in Canada than almost any of the other advanced capitalist countries because of how important the energy sector is to Canada. But it has to be done. So there has to be a very significant investment into retraining all the people that work in that sector and developing other forms of sustainable energy.
The government has the same dilemma that governments have had. It's a very difficult problem. It's a microcosm of the international problem where you have the energy-producing countries, the Saudi Arabians, the oil-producing states, not wanting to cut back because that's where their wealth comes from. That's where their revenues come from. And the rest of the world wanting to cut back on the use of fossil fuels. That's the same thing is happening in Canada.
I mean, it's not a simple problem how to replace the amount of GDP that is the Athabasca tar sands. But there's no choice to do it. to have a government that would develop that kind of industrial strategy means a government that has broken the power of finance over it. Because finance, which owns the oil companies, is simply not going to allow it in any time frame that's going to matter. It's not that finance is unaware of the problem, and it's not that the oil companies are unaware of the problem. It's not like they don't believe in the climate science. They know what it is. But so do the tobacco companies know that smoking causes cancer. It didn't stop them from marketing cigarettes to children.
So when you pay $4.5 billion for an old pipeline, don't tell me you're investing in the new economy. You know, those investments, and of course in Alberta, here again, there's jobs, there's people at stake. So, but you need to invest on those people. You need to invest in the new economy. Our plan will create, we estimate, about 300,000 jobs in the new economy. And the investment in the new economy very often create more jobs than a similar investment in what I call the old economy, the fossil fuel economy. So that's it. It's a complete change of setup. The Liberal government, I mean, they took Stephen Harper's targets for climate change, and which were already low, and they won't even attain it.
There are some potential bumps in the road, Keystone XL being one of them. I know that the president-elect has said he would rescind that permit. Certainly the premier of Alberta yesterday was trying to get some commitments for at least a conversation with the president-elect. Will Canada be making that case to him that it perhaps still should go ahead?
Oh, definitely. I mean, this is top of the agenda. Sure. We're going to be making our case, saying that Canada is the most reliable energy supplier to the United States, predictable. We've been working together for decades now. It's all about energy security in North America.
Justin Trudeau is all about talking about the threat of climate change and also maintaining complete maintaining Canada as an exporter of fossil fuel. And so if that means destroying Indigenous territories, sending the police to evict Indigenous nations at gunpoint, as they did in Wet'suwet'en over these gas pipelines, trying to subsidize pipeline projects to the tune of billions of dollars of taxpayer funds, all of those things are instrumental to what Justin Trudeau is about. And that's not Justin Trudeau. I mean, obviously the Conservatives were all about that. Harper was all about that. The NDP in Alberta was all about that, right? So it goes much deeper than Justin Trudeau or any given politician or even any political party. It's the Canadian system, and it's the same way that Canadian diplomacy has this special role in U.S. In helping the U.S., Canadian extractive industry has a specific role in the global economic system, the global corporate system. So Canada is the big mining power here. Canada is the one who gets those resources out of Indigenous territories in the most efficient way and displaces and dispossesses Indigenous nations to do it. And they have extended that model to the Americas. They've gone to Guatemala and done the same thing. They've gone to Africa. They go to Tanzania and do the same thing. They do the same thing in the Congo with Banro. There's a model of extraction and a model for dealing with the people that stand in the way of extraction that is part of the Canadian way of doing business. And that Justin Trudeau is just no exception to that.
Some people got to world. Now